Page 420, continued, poetry. In the beginning of the 20th century, poetry was very prominent in American literature. The publication of Harriet Monroe's Monroe', Poetry, a magazine of verse, in 1912 was an epoch-making event. It charted the path for future American poetry. Its publication aimed at, quote, giving to poetry her own place, comma, her own voice, unquote, stop. It claimed the existence of a public interested in poetry and augured that, quote, poetry will grow in power, comma, in beauty, comma, in significance, unquote, stop. This magazine introduced many new poets of genius like Robert Frost, Carl Sandburg, and Vachel Lindsay. These poets had wide audience appeal. T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound exercised immense influence upon the 50s of the last century. The poetry also published Eliot's The Waste Land in 1922, for which he was conferred upon the Dial DIAL Award in 1922. This award was also given in following years to Maureen Moore, E. Cummings, William Carrolls, William and Ezra Pound. T.S. Eliot, who became the naturalized citizen of England, was a favorite of the new poets in America, who imbibed his influence. He was a poet of international status. Para. Edwin Markham, Markham, 1852 to 1940, is remembered for one poem, The Man with the Hoe, Hoe, published in San Francisco Examiner, January 15, 1899. It shows the influence of the Old Testament, comma, Genesis and Millet, comma, a painter. His Lincoln, the Man of the People, is also a famous poem. His collected poems was published in 1940. Earlier it is Maureen, here it is Marine. Please check spelling. Maureen Moore, a minor poet whose observations appeared in 1924, was called, quote, an objectivist, unquote, stop. Quote, in objectivism, though an object may be chosen for treatment because of its symbolic or subjective references, comma, once it has been chosen, it is studied in its own right, unquote, stop. Eliot and Wallace Stevens praised her versification. Quote, she composes not by feel, but by she composes not by feet, F-E-E-T, but by syllables, colon. The result is not free verse, but a formal, sometimes light, comma, sometimes rigid pattern, unquote, stop. According to Moore, over-accent and over-emphasis must be avoided, and, quote, mathematics as we have it in music, comma, can be of inestimable help to a poet, stop, unquote. Her poems are dry, devoid of emotional intensity, although in poetry she called herself, quote, a literalist of imagination, unquote, stop. Some of her famous poems are When I Bury Pictures, comma, Critics and Connoisseurs, and Picking and Choosing, stop. Para. Edwin Arlington Robinson, 1869 to 1935, was influenced by the Puritan tradition and the Transcendental Romanticism. His poems appeared in two volumes, The Torrent and The Night Before, 1896, and The Children of Night, 1897. Page 421. His poems are also available in Collected Poems of Edwin Arlington Robinson, 1937. Although, quote, an almost blank despair, comma, a brooding melancholy, unquote, envelop his poetry, there is a gleam of light, a ray of hope for man to attain. His setting and background of New England, but his themes are universal in character. Some of his famous poems are Flammonde, Flammonde, comma, Ben Jonson entertains a man from Stratford, comma, Eros Turennos, Bewick Finzer, Eros Turennos, Turannos, Bewick, Bewyck, Finzer, comma, the man against the sky, comma, the glory of the nightingale, etc. His poetry explores the human soul in moments of crisis and agony. As for technique, Robinson preferred the conventional form, avoiding blank verse. Para. Robert Frost, according to the English poet Robert Graves, comma, quote, was the first American who could be honestly reckoned a master poet by world standard, ... Frost has won the title fairly not by turning his back on ancient European tradition, nor by imitating its successes, but by developing it in a way that at last matches the American climate and the American language, unquote, stop. His work in various capacities as bobbin boy, Bobbin, in a mill, comma, worker, comma, in a shoe factory, comma, reporter as a newspaper, comma, farmer and country school teacher, made an impact on his poetry. His poems were published in A Boy's Will, 1913, comma, North of Boston, 1914, comma, Mountain Interval, 1916, comma, New Hampshire, 1923, comma, A Further Range, comma, A Witness Tree, 1942, comma, Steeple Bush, comma, A Masque, Masque of Mercy, 1947, and Collected Poems, 1949. His critical opinions and views on poetry appear in the figure A Poem Makes, which in his preface written to the enlarged edition of the Collected Poems. To him, poetry, quote, begins in delight and ends in wisdom, unquote, stop. Froster's poetry has the flavor of New England life and an insight into New England character. Beneath the simple and clear surface of his poetry lies a sharp penetration into life's complexities. Egbert S. Oliver writes, quote, he uses the, single quote, facts, single unquote, of life, comma, but it becomes apparent that the fact becomes metaphor and symbol that Frost is penetrating into value and experience, unquote, stop. His famous poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, tells of a man's temptation to answer the strange call of the vowels by getting into it, and of his resisting the temptation by thinking of the promise he has to keep. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, comma, and miles to go before I sleep, comma, and miles to go before I sleep, stop. Para. It is a highly moving lyric remarkable for superb craftsmanship and depth of meaning. It is an interesting allegory of life and death. Para. Frost was a original poet whose region was New England, more particularly New Hampshire. He was a poet of nature. He was not a nature mystic. Froster's poetry is simple, lucid, and clear. Cecil Day Lewis observes that the simplicity of his verse, quote, is the simplicity not of nature, but of a serious and profoundly critical spirit, unquote, stop. His place is assured in American poetry. Para. Carl Sandburg, C-A-R-L, S-A-N-D-B-U-R-G, 1878 to 1967, began his poetic career by contributing poems to the magazine Poetry. His first poem, entitled Chicago, was first published in 1914. The Chicago poem expressed a different mood. Sandburg claimed, Cologne quote, "Poems are result of moods, stop. I don't approach a subject in the same mood every day, stop." He sings about the vastness of the American landscape, comma, of the joy of work and of the brotherhood of man, stop. His poems are unconventional in theme and tone, stop. Chicago is a symbol of newness and hopefulness. He discards the past and its fetters. He sings life, comma, Chicago stands for the present and the future, which he celebrates in his poetry. For example, there is no unquote sign. I speak of new cities and new peoples, comma. I tell you the past is a bucket of ashes. I tell you yesterday is a wind gone down, comma, a sun dropped in the west. I tell you there is nothing in the world, only an ocean of tomorrow, a sky of tomorrows. Para. He was alive to the problems of the people and had firm faith in democracy like Whitman. He was against social conventions and religious hypocrisy. He was a subtle and unconventional poetic craftsman. He coined his own idiom and expression to articulate his feelings, but it comes to him from the streets and not from dictionaries. There is subtle and hidden music in his poetry. Para. Chicago was the seat of new poetic impulse. Vachel Lindsay was another important poet of the Chicago group, which consisted of Carl Sandburg and Edgar Lee Masters. These three poets were the makers of a new tradition in American poetry. Lindsay's early moon poems, The Comet of Prophecy, The Spider, and The Ghost of the Fly, and many other poems are about dreams and phantasms, lacking in depth and congruity. He stormed into popularity with the publication of General William Booth Enters into Heaven and Other Poems, 1913, page 422. Edgar Lee Masters, a lawyer of profession and a poet by avocation, became popular with the publication of Spoon River Anthology, 1915. His poems were also published in the Mirror. There are no phantoms, no visions in his poetry. He deals with real situations and real characters. He was an unconventional poet who, according to the Literary History of the United States, comma, quote, was most in sympathy with his libertarians in love, comma, his free thinkers and the idealists whom the money perverted villains, was most in sympathy with the libertarians in love, comma, his free thinkers and the idealists whom the money perverted villains have defeated, stop, unquote. Para. Emmy Lowell, 1874 to 1925, a minor poet, was an imagist. She contributed much to the advancement of the imagist movement. Selected poems of Emmy Lowell, 1928, and the complete poetical works of Emmy Lowell, 1955, appeared posthumously. Her poems such as Lilacs were often the subject of criticism or parody. But Patter's, P-A-T-T-E-R-S, was highly admired for its poetic worth. Para. Ezra Pound was one of the most controversial and most influential poets of America. Eliot wrote, quote, Pound did not create the poets, but he created a situation in which, for the first time, there was modern movement in poetry, stop, unquote. He began writing poetry in his college days at the University of Pennsylvania and at Hamilton College, full stop. William Carrolls, Williams Marianne Moore, and Hilda Doolittle, known as H.D., were his poet friends. His first volume of poems appeared in Venice in 1908. Personae, Persone, was published in London in 1909 and Exultations immediately after. His masterpiece, Hugh Selwyn, Selwyn, Mauberley, Mauberley, published in London in 1920, was a turning point in his poetic career. He was given Bollingen Award for the Pisan, Pisan cantos in 1949. Para. Pound's life was full of ups and downs. He was dismissed from his position teaching Romance language and literature from Wabash, WABSH, Colleges, Indiana. He left America in 1908 as he left disgusted with the intellectual climate of America. He traveled France, Italy, Spain, and many other countries. In 1939, Hamilton College, where Pound received his BA degree, awarded him the Doctor of Letters degree. The citation said, quote, Your feet have trodden paths, ... into provincial and Italian poetry, into Anglo-Saxon and Chinese, stop. From all these excursions you have back treasure, ... Your name is permanently linked with the development of English poetry in the 20th century. Your reputation is international, you have guided many poets into new paths, you have pointed new directions, ... You have ever been a generous champion of young writers, unquote, stop. In 1945, Pound was detained on the charge of treason in America, but the charges were later withdrawn. Then he was confined in a hospital for the insane. He was released from custody in 1958 on the condition of leaving USA. Pound took keen interest in the publication of the works of Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, James Joyce, W.B. Yeats, and Tagore in America. He took keen interest in Japanese and Chinese poetry. He has been called the inventor of Chinese poetry in modern age. In his role as a, quote, culture poet, unquote, he did much, quote, to conserve the best of the past and to renew lost principle of order, unquote, stop. Harriet Monroe, the founder of the magazine Poetry, had read Pound's poetry with admiration. She made him the London correspondent of poetry. In London, he promoted the Imagism, a poetic movement, initiated by T.E. Hume, Hulme. Para. Pound's masterpiece, Hugh Selwyn Mauberley, Mauberley, quote, a positive document of sensibility, unquote, in the words of Eliot, reflects the, quote, miscellaneousness of modern culture, the absence of direction, ... the incongruity of the modern world to the artist, semicolon, and his dubious status there, stop. It offers, ... a representative experience of the phase of English poetry in which it became plain that the Romantic tradition was exhausted, ... It has the impersonality of great poetry, Cologne. Its technical perfection means a complete detachment and control, stop, unquote. The Pisan cantos, broken but ambitious monologues, quote, were designed to cover loosely the wreckage of human civilization in the ancient comma, the medieval comma, and the modern periods, unquote, stop. Para. As a poetic craftsman, Pound had a keen ear of music, which according to him is essential to poetry. He also had a keen sense for language. His language is visual and concrete. He chose fresh epithets and fresh metaphors to express his poetic sensations. Images in his poetry are not mere decoration, but the very essence of an intuitive language. Para. Pound was the force behind the revival of modern poetry. Frost said that Pound, quote, had an extraordinary capacity for making poets out of little or nothing, unquote, stop. Amy Lowell wrote, quote, he could make you write, unquote, stop. It was the result of his forceful influence that a host of young voices were heard in America, notable among whom were Amy Lowell, Robinson Jeffers, Edgar Lee Masters, Edna Millay, Millay, Sarah Tisdale, Teasdale, and Vachel Lindsay, stop. Page 423, para. Hart, H-A-R-T, Crane, C-R-A-N-E, 1899-1832, I think it should be 1899 to 1932, printing mistake, had a very chaotic and unhappy life. He was well versed with the works of Donne, Elizabethan writers, Whitman, Melville, T.S. Eliot, and current New York writers. In the beginning of his poetic career, he composed short lyrics. His first poems were collected in White Building, 1926. In these poems, he emerges as a budding poet who uses language plastically with a sharp sense of color, weight, and sound. Some of his fine poems in this volume are Wine Menagerie, Praise for an Urn and Vitalis, Vetalies. His famous poem, The Marriage of Faustus and Helen. The Marriage of Faustus, Faustus and Helen, 1922-23, recasts the myth of, quote, past and present, unquote, stop. Para. Para. At the age of 19, he began writing The Bridge, which was published in 1930. It is Crane's, quote, longest and most ambitious poem, and one of the most durable of the modern American attempts at a poem which might be called epic, stop. It is a symbolical poem which owes much to Whitman, stop. It is an attempt, quote, to encompass the myth of America, using the symbol as Brooklyn Bridge as symbol, unquote, stop. Quote, the bridge, unquote, for Crane is the symbol of, quote, logos, L-O-G-O-S, unquote, in man's quest for the absolute. Crane's poetic imagination was assimilative and integrative in the sense that the machine and complexities of modern life must be assimilated with poetry. Egbert S. Oliver remarks, quote, Crane conceived his The Bridge as bringing a positive assimilation into modern literature in contrast to Eliot's The Waste Land, stop, unquote. E. Cummings, para. E. Cummings, C-U-M-M-I-N-G-S, 1894 to 1962, was an individualist in modern American poetry. He insisted, quote, it's no use trying to pretend that most people and ourselves are alike, unquote, stop. He, quote, worked out methods of artistic expression to capture the individual emotion, to arrest for a moment individual attention, unquote, stop. Although he achieved distinction as a painter, he wrote and published poems for over 45 years. He was a renowned poet too. Cummings' poems appeared in many collections. Tulips and Chimneys, 1923, 95 poems, 1958, 100 selected poems, 1959, and 50 poems, 1960. His other books are The Enormous Room, 1922, Amy, EIMI, 1933, and 6 Non-Lectures, 1953. He, quote, is a lyricist of romantic love, who is also a romantic anarchist in the New England tradition and believes that a poem is an inspired moment breaking through the bar of syntax. Stop. In Tulip and Chimneys, he made abundant use of, quote, the typographical distortion, and unpredictability in punctuation, capitalization, word spacing, and word arrangement, which became a kind of trademark for his work, unquote, stop. Although he is sometimes troublesome and obscure, the poetic expression often is noticeable for lyrical beauty, intensity, spontaneity and beauty, stop. Para. Robinson Jeffers, 1887 to 1962, published over a dozen volumes of his poems. Selected poems of Robinson Jeffers, 1938, Be Angry at the Sea, 1941, Medea, MEDEA, 1946, The Double Axe and Other Poems, 1948, and Hungerfield and Other Poems, 1954. His first volume of poems, Flagons, Flagons and Apples, 1912, is conventionally romantic. He was not influenced by any poet or any poetic movement. In his long poems, Jeffers deals with unrelieved violence in all its manifestations. Incest, rape, murder, which were the dark consequences of the First World War. He was influenced by Spengler's Decline of the West. He foresees the fall of Western civilization and sometimes welcomes that fall. There is an undercurrent of pessimism in Jeffers' poetry. In his shorter lyrics, he shows mastery over a powerful, easy-flowing rhythm. Para. Archibald MacLeish, MACLEISH, M capital, was also an experimentalist. He held many public offices with distinction and integrity. He produced several radio plays in verse. His famous poetic drama, J.B., is based on the Book of Job, but with action transferred into a modern situation. It won MacLeish his third Pulitzer Prize. His poems were collected in Collected Poems 1917 to 1952, published 1953, and Songs of Eve 1955. American Letter 1928 and Conquistador, an epic of Spanish assault, are his famous poems. He won Pulitzer Prize for the latter. Para. William Carlos Williams, 1883 to 1963, a physician by profession and poet by avocation, influenced by Imagism and the Imagist movement. His poems are available in Complete Collected Poems 1906 to 38, published 1938, Collected Early Poems of William Carroll's Williams 1950, Collected Later Poetry of William Carroll's William 1950, and Paterson 1946 to 58. His autobiography appeared in 1951. Williams is a 5-book poem on New Jersey City. Patterson, 1946-58, which is, quote, a kind of epic of a city, working in the history of the city, its mythology and its character, and characters, unquote, stop. He belongs to mainstream of American poetry. Like Whitman, he is a singer of the glory of man. He is a thought-provoking and influential poet. Stop. Page 424. Para. Wallace Stevens, 1879 to 1955, contributed poems to poetry. He published a slender volume of his poems entitled Harmonium in 1923, which suggests the symbolic character of his poetry. His other publications are Ideas of Order, 1935, The Man with the Blue Guitar, 1937, and Collected Poems, 1955. His most persistent subject is the opposition between bare reality and what the imagination can make of it, unquote, says the Literary History of the United States. This opposition is presented through highly expressive symbols. His use of symbols and imagery is deliberate and controlled. He uses satire and irony to express the decadence of modern civilization. Egbert S. Oliver remarks, colon quote, but his more essential affinity is with modern abstract painting and its method, comma, such as Picasso represents, stop. He used bright tints, tints, comma, lavish sounds, comma, done with precise elegance, stop. He relished the bare image, but he rarely left his poem bare, colon. He preferred, quote, the essential guidelines of quote, the essential gaudiness, gaudiness of poetry, unquote, and he knew how to achieve it. Para. Some memorable poetical works of modern period are Edna St. Miller's 2nd April 1923 and Fatal Interview 1931. Stephen Vincent Bennett's John Brown's Body 1928. Conrad Aiken's Preludes and Brownstone Eclogues. Marianne Moore's Observations 1924. John Crow Ransom's Selected Poems and Essays 1955. Robert Lowell's Lord Weary's Castle 1946. Life Studies, comma, for the Union Dead 1964, comma, Near the Ocean 1967 and Armies of the Night 1968. Lowell is credited with establishing what is called, quote, confessional poetry, unquote, comma, quote, poetry having a highly autobiographical subject matter, comma, a fairly robust free form and technique and written with an almost painful honesty, unquote, stop. His Lord Weary's Castle won the Pulitzer Prize. Mailer mentions Lowell in his Pulitzer Prize winner, Armies of the Night, 1968, hailing as, quote, America's greatest living poet, unquote, stop. He was awarded a posthumous Pulitzer for his final collection, Day by Day, comma, Epilogue, comma, his last poems, is a premonition of his death in 1977. Drama, para. Drama was not a major literary genre in 18th and 19th centuries in American literature. During the early years of the 20th century, Clyde, Clyde Fitch, Fitch, and Langdon, Lagdon Mitchell, Mitchell, wrote some plays, but their themes had no relation with contemporary society. Some successful novels were also rendered into plays. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and Mark Twain's The Gilded Age were dramatically rendered. During the second decade of the last century, William Vaughan's Vaughan Moody's Moody', The Great Divide, and Faith Healer and Edward Sheldon's The Nigger and the Boss had some relation to contemporary life. Augustus Thomas dramatized regional peculiarities and introduced local color in American drama. All these writers were handicapped by a tendency towards sentimentality and a readiness to follow theatrical convention. The rise of the little theatre heralded the era of departure from conventions imposed by the conventional theatre. Para. Eugene O'Neill, Eugeneo''Neill, 1888 to 1953, a major figure in American literature, is one of the most eminent playwrights of the world. His plays ushered in a new era in the history of American drama. He introduced classicism in American drama at a time when it was enmeshed in sentimentalism. His view of man in his plays is essentially tragic. Though his plays are modern, he strove to bring into his work an effect in harmony with traditional tragedy. He drew from Greek drama such conventions as the chorus and the asides, which suited his purpose of exploring the vast, frightening terrain of human thought, unquote, stop, para. Para. O'Neill was not interested in the relationship between man and man. He was mainly interested in the relationship between God and man. Thus, quote, man's destiny, and man's judgment under God is ever present to O'Neill's concern with dramatic involvement and character, unquote, stop. Para. His first one-act play, Bound East for Cardiff, in melodramatic and Long Day's Journey into Night, is related to his family life. He was in the forefront of American theatre with the publication of the Pulitzer Prize plays Beyond the Horizon 1920, The Emperor Jones 1920, and Anna Christie 1921. A Pulitzer Prize play, and The Hairy Ape 1922. Commenting on these four plays, Egbert S. Oliver writes, Cologne, quote, here was a dramatist of great power in these four plays, combining a realism with symbolic expressionism and relating man to the mysterious forces which tug at him and shape his destiny, stop. Nothing like this dramatic achievement but had ever before been felt in American literature, unquote, stop. Para. O'Neill was an experimentalist in American literature. All God's Children, Chillun, got things, 1924, and Desire under the M's, ELMS, 1924, follow the realistic tradition. The Great Gold Brown, 1926, experiments with masks and symbols, page 425. Lazarus Laughed, 1927, and Marco Millions, 1928, go back to older legends for symbolic themes. Strange Interludes, 1928, the Pulitzer Prize Play of the Year, uses dramatic stream of consciousness technique. And Mourning, Mourning, becomes Electra, 1931, uses a Greek theme and structure in a New England Civil War period. It is a study of character and fate. Our Wilderness, 1933, is a comedy on New England family life. He was awarded Nobel Prize for Literature in 1938. His other plays are The Iceman Cometh, 1946, Long Day's Journey into Night, a Pulitzer Prize play, and A Touch of the Poet, 1957. Para. O'Neill's sense of theatre was so strong that always his plays were found to be more effective on the stage than during a literary reading of them. He is the first universally recognized world dramatist America produced. Para. Other playwrights of the 20th century are Sidney Howard, S. N. Behrman, Philip Barry, Robert Sherwood, Moss Hart, and S. Kaufman. Some of their plays are well written, but they lack in the passionate intensity and characterizes O'Neill's plays. Elmer Rice's The Adding Machine 1923 is a significant play of this period. Thornton Wilder's Our Town 1938 introduces the stage manager for the first time. Maxwell Anderson's What Price Glory is social document. Para. Psychological studies and Freud's principle of psychoanalysis influenced modern American drama. Psychological themes that found their way into the theater were parental rejection, reversal to adolescence, and latent homosexuality. Arthur Lawrence, Laurent''S, A Clearing in the Woods, 1957, a psychobiography, deals with the incessant quest for happiness and self-discovery. William Inge's, Inge's, plays Picnic and Bus Stop are important production of modern period. Para. Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller are two major dramatists after O'Neill. Williams's important plays are The Glass Menagerie 1945, Streetcar Named Desire 1947, for which he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize and Drama Critics Circle Award. The Rose Tattoo 1950, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof 1953, and The Night of the Iguana 1962. He was given Pulitzer Prize and Drama Circle Award for Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. His other plays are Summer and Smoke 1948, Camino Real 1953, I Rise in Flame, Cried the Phoenix 1951, which indicate his interest in D.H. Lawrence. He also published poems, short stories, and a short novel entitled The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone 1950. Williams's Cat on a Hot Tin Roof 1955 was an electric drama of greed and mendacity, Mendacity. Other plays, Sweet Word of Youth 1959 and Period of Adjustment 1960, did not greatly enhance his reputation. Literary History of the United States remarks, quote, he was a mixed achievement, The symbols were too often intrusive, the violence at times less dramatic than pathological, and the vision, when it faltered, excluded self-hate, But Williams's romantic vision seldom faltered so drastically. His dialogue sang, his characters, always supercharged with emotion, compelled us to enter their lives and share their fate, And his moods changed so cannily, from poignancy to humor to sheer terror, that his audiences were made to experience a lifetime in an evening. Unquote. Para. It was with Arthur Miller that post-war drama acquired new importance and dignity. His famous plays are Man Who Had All the Luck 1944, All My Sons 1947, Death of a Salesman 1949, The Crucible 1953, View from the Bridge 1950, and A Memory of Two Mondays 1955. All his plays are domestic plays that use the family as the testing place for the protagonist. He shows great interest for the psychological and social forces that form and distort the family and the individual. The most vital factor in his plays is the portrayal of the individual in conflict with society. Para. Some important plays of the modern period are Gelber's, Gelber''s, The Connection 1959, Jack Richardson's The Prodigal 1960, Edward Elby's The Zoo Story 1958, The American Drama and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf! Exclamation. Para. Prose. Modern period in American literature prompted the development of prose, the advancement in journalism, growing interest in science and speculative thinking and psychology, the all-embracing spirit of rationality and realism contributed much to the development of prose. The Harvard philosophers and thinkers Santayana, Royce, and James are distinguished philosophers who wrote fine prose. Santayana was the finest of them all. In his famous collections of essay, Persons and Places 1944 and The Middle Span 1945, we find some, quote, absorbing essays in autobiography, unquote, stop. In The Middle Span 1945, we find some, quote, absorbing essays in autobiography, unquote, stop. He described himself as, quote, a decided materialist, dash, apparently the only one living, unquote, stop. Page 426. He expounded his philosophy in the 5 volumes of The Life of Reason and the 4 of The Realms of Being. Santayana's style is quiet and conversational, comma, quote, with a slow and meditative rhythm, comma, exquisitely sensitive to the sounds and connotations of words, as well as to their explicit meanings, unquote, stop. His words are well chosen. His prose is the radiant example of, quote, urbane and polished writing, unquote, stop. As a writer, his place is secure and permanent in American literature, stop. Para. John Dewey's Reconstruction in Philosophy 1920 and Democracy and Education 1916 contain his philosophical thoughts. The literary history of the United States comments on his style, quote, he wrote as he spoke, stop. The writing is invariably charged with thought, semicolon. It always comes at first hand out of his experience, semicolon. It is downright, comma, unpretentious, comma, transparently honest, ... Dewey had none of that feeling for the magic of words which saved the most difficult pages of Santayana. He lacked the sense, comma, partly logical, partly aesthetic, comma, of economy of words to thought, comma, which hits an idea of OFF precisely and memorably, semicolon. There is strangely little that is quotable in all the vast volume of his writing, unquote, stop. Para. Walter Lippmann, Lippmann, a journalist, was a staunch socialist endowed with, quote, a graceful and facile style, unquote, stop. He expressed his humanist outlook in Preface to Morals, 1929, Reinhold Niebuhr's The Nature and Destiny of Man, 1941-43, has little stylistic excellence. Rufus Jones, in his Studies in Mystical Religion, 1909, New Studies in Mystical Religion, 1927, Some Exponents of Mystical Religion, 1930, and many other works developed a religious philosophy which shows the influence of Emerson. Walter B. Pitkin's Life Begins at 40, 1932, The Ways of Knowing, 1925, Ralph Barton Perry's General Theory of Value, 1926, and The Thought and Character of William James, 1935. Arthur O. Lovejoy's The Revolt Against Dualism, 1930, and The Great Chain of Being are some worth mentioning prose works of this period. Para. Alfred North Whitehead, an outstanding philosopher, was an exponent of speculative philosophy. He is rational in his approach. To him God is, quote, the poet of the world, comma, with tender patience leading it by his vision of truth, comma, beauty and goodness, unquote, stop. His major works are Process and Reality, 1929, Science and the Modern World, 1925, Religion in the Making, 1926, and The Aims of Education, 1929. His style is epigrammatic and lucid. His style is marred by obscurity, which is caused by his, quote, coining words of his own, unquote, and of, quote, giving familiar words and phrases new and strange significations, stop, unquote. Para. Paul Elmore Moore, M.O.R.E., 1864 to 1937, was a critic, thinker, and writer. He is famous for Shelburne Essays, 1904 to 1921, and 3 volumes of New Shelburne, Shelburne Essays, 1928 to 1935. He was more interested in Hindu writings than in Greek or Christian writings for personal confirmations of his romantic insight. In 1898, Moore published A Century of Indian Epigrams, 1898. He was the pioneer of the new humanism in American criticism. Para. He wrote, quote, I am utterly convinced that literature divorced from life is an empty pursuit, comma, and that an honest search for the meaning of life must lead to the simple faith of theism, stop, unquote. Moore's great value and his contribution to American literary criticism, says Egbert S. Oliver, comma, quote, lie in his ability to give in one essay a sweep of an author's work, unquote, stop. His style is simple, comma, clear and lucid. Para. Irving, I-R-V-I-N-G, Babbitt, B-A-B-B-I-T-T, 1865 to 1933, hailed as a Brahmin, comma, quote, worthy Brahmin come to battle with the confusion of times, comma, unquote, was a foremost literary critic. He opposed Romanticism and stood for harmony, decorum, and intellectual brilliance. Babbitt felt that the Romantic tradition had led America to a denial of positive values, substituting mere self-expression. His distinguished works are The Masters of Modern French Criticism, 1912, Rousseau and Romanticism, 1917, and Democracy and Leadership, 1924. He clearly expounded his views on, quote, taste, comma, discipline, comma, standards, comma, the beauties of Hellenism, comma, the necessity of moral content in art, stop, unquote. His famous essay, The Critic and American Life, in his book On Being Creative and Other Essays, 1932, is a clear statement of his views on criticism. He discarded personal expressionism, the personality cult, and the chaotic individualism which characterized the life and literature during and after the First World War. Babbitt's critical opinions are based on Romanticism, naturalism, humanitarianism, and humanism. Para. Alan Tate, T-A-T-E', famous works are Reactionary Essays on Poetry and Ideas, 1936, comma, On the Limits of Poetry, 1948, comma, The Man of Letters in the Modern World, 1955, and Collected Essays, 1959. As a critic, he was concerned with poetry and with the relationship of the writer to society. Para. Carl Sandburg, the renowned poet, is famous in American prose for his biographical works on Abraham Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, The Prairie, P-R-A-I-R-I-E, Years, 1926, page 427. And Abraham Lincoln, The War Years, 1939, semicolon. And his autobiography, Always, The Young Strangers, 1953, pictures the author's early life and the country which molded him and of which he wrote. Stop.